On December 4th, 1999, Whistler lost an icon. This is the only known video footage of Seppo.
Seppo Makinen came to the valley in the early 60s looking for work.
I guess my price was a little low for clearing the ski run, and I got a job.
Any of the wood that you cut off the ski run go into building your house?
No, I didn't, because the early days runs were narrow and there's no roads to get the timber out, so that we had to buck and pile and burn basically everything up there just to get the clearings and skiable.
Shortly after his passing, some of Seppo's friends gathered to remember him. These are some of their memories, starting with a letter from Eddie Shum, as read by Paul Burrows.
I was one of 2 men Müller lifts sent to Whistler from Switzerland in 1965 to install the original gondola, the red chair and the 2 T-bars. The first few years at Whistler was some of the best of my life. The camaraderie amongst the locals was something I never experienced before or since. People needed each other. Without TV, theatre or other sophisticated entertainment, people had time for each other. Life was simple but fulfilling and enjoyable. It still is, but those years were special. I first came to Whistler on July the 1st, 1965. The very next day I hiked up the mountain and took it to look at the job site and the progress that had been made with clearing the lift lines, building of the tower foundations, etc. On the upper part of the mountain, the red chair area, there was a narrow trail built for horses, which is called the pony trail, to take materials and tools up to the different sites as they were building the mountain. I was following this trail that was winding its way up through heavy forest, enjoying the peace and quiet in the woods. After a while I heard a faint clinking noise. I stopped. The noise got louder. Soon I heard footsteps. The noise came from above. I looked in that direction. Soon I could not believe my eyes. A mountain of a variety of stuff came bouncing down the trail. There were at least 2 chainsaws, a number of metal gas and oil cans, axes, a tent, 2 or 3 duffel bags, and other miscellaneous items. I stood and watched this mountain of stuff slowing down and coming to a halt in front of me. An arm cleared some equipment to the side, and a tanned, smiling face came into view. "Hello," said a happy-sounding voice. This is how I met Seppo, the happy Finn. He took the time to stop, unload most of his heavy load, and we spent about 15 minutes talking. He asked me who I was, welcomed me to Whistler Mountain, told me what he was doing and how it was going, and so on. I almost instantly liked the man. His smile was warm, his welcome sincere, and there seemed to be no beating around the bush in what he said. Everything about him was simple and open. On that day we parted with him saying, "See you at Cypress Lodge tonight. I'll buy you a beer." Over the next few years I got to know Seppo a lot better, but my first impression was bang on. He proved to be honest, reliable, generous and fun-loving. There were times when he and his crew played hard, but I've never seen anyone working harder and longer hours than they did, packing all the gear up the mountain and down again, working from dawn to dusk, camping out overnight, and going at it early again the next morning was their regular schedule. Over the years I saw Seppo's generosity and good-heartedness cause him some difficulties. People took advantage of it, first with his marriage to a gorgeous model, and later with several business transactions. Seppo believed in people's word, because he could not even think that he would ever break his own. The last time I saw Seppo was in about 1995. He had slowed down a bit since I first met him, but I still would not have dared to challenge him to an arm wrestle. He told me about a few bad experiences he'd had, money and property he'd lost. But he did not seem to be bitter about it. Accepted his own. He was still happy, he was still smiling, and still offering to buy me a drink. Overall, Seppo was a great asset for Whistler, for the physical work he did, as well as for the great influence he had on the people of the community. In my opinion, he deserves to be remembered as one of Whistler's great pioneers, right up there with Stefan Pless and Franz Wilhelmsen.
Article that Paul read really brought back a lot of memories, and brought back from early Whistler, 1966, 67, 68, when there were very few people here. And in our little small community, Seppo was a legend even then. And these young kids would come up to be ski instructors, and they'd be really good skiers. But it was all, "But have you met Seppo? Have you seen him walk up the mountain to ski down?" And he was a legend even back then. I think the thing that I still, even, I don't know, 25 years later, still go, oh, Seppo. It had to do with real estate. Now this is when Alpine Meadows and Emerald Estate was being planned by Capilano Highlands. And, well, we'd go walking to say, oh, gee, that looks like a nice lot, and this one looks pretty good here, and, oh, I'd like that one there. Now, with Capilano Highlands, their financing was, you paid 10% down and $100 a month for 4 years. And I remember the first lot I bought was $2,700. It was on Buckhorn Drive in Alpine Meadows. So it was $270 down and $100 a month. Well, my former husband and I bought a couple of lots, or we put holes on a couple of lots. And then I one day was looking and saying, hey, you know what, we can't afford the $100 for each of these lots. So we got to release some of these holes. And Seppo was saying, but I like the ones up in Emerald. So an arrangement was made that the lots would still stay in our name, but when it came time to buy them, they'd really be Seppo's. And the time arrived, and Seppo decided that he really wanted the lots, but it wasn't a good time to have them put in his name. For the next 3 years, every 2 or 3 or 4 months, he'd call me, I'd be in the parking lot or something, Lynn, dig into his pocket, and out would come $5, $8, $1,000. Here for the payments. I'm saying we have to get this on paper, Seppo. No, everything's fine. And this money would just keep coming. I did draw something up that he did say, okay, he would hold that. I'm saying, if David and I get killed, at least you know that it's your lots. And one time I remember asking, I'm saying, Seppo, how do you keep track? Bookwork. Your bookkeeping. He goes, oh, it's easy. I have a big box. When the bills come in, I pay them. I put them all in the box. And then when tax time comes, I push everything down really hard, and I take out what I think is about 25% of them, and I do up my books. I figure it kind of all balances out. And even now, that's what I shake my head about. His bookkeeping wasn't the greatest, but other than that, he's one of the most fantastic people I've ever met. Thank you.
Well, I certainly remember meeting Seppo in '65, the summer, because I was building my cabin along with my partner down in next to Alpine Villas, and it got into the fall and we had an early snow that fall. It was actually early October, and we were living in a little, it was a trapper shack on Bottomless Lake, just in where Highland Lodge is now, but there was an old trapper shack there, but it was, the stove had a chimney that leaked, so the smoke level was about this high in the cabin. We had to walk around like this after working on the cabin all day, so we would go over to where they were building the base facilities, and sure as heck, Seppo would turn up with a couple from his crew. So the whatever drinking supplies were available, we'd get into that, and we'd hear, I'd worked logging for a couple of years in the summer as a student, and so we kind of hit it off, and I couldn't believe the stories of what Seppo was doing, because they had their base camp just pretty low in the mountain, and they would hike that damn mountain every day. As the reading that Paul had, you'd see them going up the hill with a chainsaw on each shoulder, plus their gas cans, and they would hike. And of course, they were doing the upper areas first, and the snow gradually drove them down the mountain, but by the time in October, they were on the lower sections, and every night there they were hanging about in the construction area, because there were some heaters in there. So we'd have a few drink and the stories and the logging stories, and that's when we first realized how bloody big this mountain was, when you realized the job that they were doing. I mean, we ride up there in the lifts now, but what Seppo and his crew did was truly physically enormous, and the spirit and the storytelling. And I must say, I think that of all the many years that I spent with Seppo and talking to him, I think I only understood 10% of what he said. But it was always interesting, and you remember the excitement in his voice. He was always excited, forever. right up to the, I saw him not too long before he passed away, but even then there was that excitement in his voices and his love of life. Yeah. One of the true joys of people I've known in this mountain, I think. Good guy.
Wearing my own hat, I met Seppo probably around the same time, 1965, when I first came up, before the mountain started, and then I came up a year after, February, to work on the ski patrol. And Seppo always had, he sort of established a relationship with people, and it was kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge thing. And he made fun of his own inadequacies with the English language, because he sort of spoke Finglish, which was a mixture of Finnish and English. And after a while you got to understand him. I mean, Walter spoke Pol English, Walter Zabrowski. He had his own version of the language as well. So Whistler was kind of populated by some very interesting characters, and Seppo was one of them. The crews he used to bring up here were all mostly Finnish, big guys, and he didn't pay them for a while. He'd bring them up from the Vancouver area, somewhere around Gastown in that area, and he'd make them work. He'd put them to work, and he'd give them the food and the accommodation and everything that they needed, and the chainsaws and whatever that they had. And they were just in the same Seppo army. They'd put the chainsaw on one shoulder and the gasoline can on the other. And these guys would go up like the Chilkoot Pass going to look for gold in the Yukon. You see these guys going up the mountain in a single file. And they'd work for maybe 3 weeks. And then they'd get a little ticked off. And finally, Seppo had to break down and give them some money, because he knew that when he paid them, they were going to go the hell off back to Vancouver and just go camp out in Gastown and not come, and just drink solidly. He stayed behind. He wasn't that hard a drinker. People tend to think Seppo was a hard drinker, but he wasn't really that hard a drinker. But these guys were. So then he'd let them go back to the city, and a week later or 4 days later, he'd have to drive down in his old blue truck, to go and try and round them up. And some of them might be in the police station, some of them might be in the detox tank. I don't know where he found them, but he found them. And he'd bring them back and start all over again, because they'd drunk all their money. He'd start all over again, another 3 weeks' work, and then they'd pay them again, they all go back. And that was sort of a cycle that went on, And the good thing in those days, the WCB wasn't too vigilant about things, because Seppo was a past master at some really interesting logging practices, which are totally illegal. One of them was notching. Notching is when you go up a hill, up a slope, and you notch the trees from the bottom up. It's a bit like, this dominoes effect, where they have these contests to see how many dominoes they can get to all fall down when the first one goes off. Well, somebody used to do that with trees. So he'd notch the trees lower down, and he'd go up and he'd find, below a big tree, he'd notch maybe 10 or 15 trees, and he'd go up and he'd cut the big one down. And the big one would fall down, and of course the others would all be notched so that they were ready to go. And the domino effect of the first tree falling on the top would take all the others down with it, which is a lot easier than having to cut every one down. But it's not a recognized safe logging practice, but that's what he used to do. As I said, Seppo did most of it, and then he did, came back a little later on when the black chair was put in, and Seppo was around and everything else. But he was still notching even then, cutting the trees down.
I came to Whistler a long time ago too, and Seppo was our neighbor on Nestor's Road, and we were renting a cabin for our office, and some days Seppo would be working around the yard there, and he'd say, well, I got to build a swimming pool. And I thought, God, what's he going to build a swimming pool at Whistler? It's kind of crazy place to build a swimming pool. But anyway, he got into it, and we did some layout work for him, and for entertainment at night, we'd go down there and drink beer and operate his little backhoe. And one day, we drank an awful lot of beer, I think, and the backhoe fell into the hole. so we had a lot of difficulty getting this thing out. We had to get some, I forget who else actually came to help us get it out of there. I think there was lots of equipment around. We hoisted it out and got on with the digging, but it took us most of that summer to dig that swimming pool. And it was there until the fire that burnt the place down, and I think there was water in it. We used water in it one time to put a fire out in the building. The volunteer fire department didn't have much water in those days. And we just enjoyed ourselves immensely with the hospitality and the help that Seppo gave in the whole neighborhood and the whole community. And I really miss that guy too. It was a lot of fun to have him around.
Very brief, and I was fortunate to interview Seppo several years ago. And it was kind of interesting. I had just run into him at the post office, and he'd always be, what you in there at the museum, And so I said, well, I'd like to interview you sometime, Seppo. So he's like, well, let's go right now and have a coffee. So off we went to McDonald's, and I asked him, I said, how did you meet Franz Wilhelmsen, and where did you meet him? And he said that he first came up to Alta Lake in '56, and he had been working on some of the hydro lines. And when the rumor went through that the ski area was going to be developed, he went to Vancouver, and I guess Franz was selling shares for Garibaldi Lifts Limited at the P&E. I guess they had a booth there. So he went and introduced himself to Franz and said he was familiar with the area. And then it was after that that I had spoken with Franz just to get his side of the story. And Franz told me that he didn't need to ask for a reference. He said, I just took one look at Seppo, and he said, I thought he knew what he was talking about, and so he hired him on the spot at the P&E, and it was the summer of '63, Seppo told me, that they sort of had a verbal agreement to would be the future. If they could come up with the $500,000 to develop the, put in the lifts, then Seppo had a job. So I always thought that was a very interesting story on how the two of them met.
Seppo lived a very, Seppo's life was quite up and down a bit, and when he was rich, he was very, very rich. And when he was poor, he was really quite broke. And it's an amazing cycle of stories. I hope Paul Fournier will forgive me for just relaying some of these, but he had a Thunderbird convertible, which and he was a Paul Bunyan, and he was a ladies' man. I mean, he fancied himself with some justification, and he'd go off he'd make a whole bunch of money in those days doing his thing here, and then he'd go off, after he got tired of getting his crew rousted out of whatever they were, and come up to the mountain. Then he'd go off somewhere and spend it, and he'd go to Hawaii or he'd go to California. He drove to California in his convertible, and he'd lie around the pool and he'd just do the old thing, and he really was quite a character outside of Whistler that most of the people at Whistler never saw him in that fashion, because Seppo the Gigolo was a very different man than Seppo the Logger. And Seppo the Gigolo, really did, I think, have a way with the ladies, and he had this convertible, and he sort of, looked at them, and he was a big, strong, strapping guy, And he did, I think we've pretty well established he did have two wives over time.
He specialized in stewardess.
Not at the same time.
He specialized in
stewardesses, yeah. He didn't have, and they were gorgeous ladies who had been really taken with Seppo when he was away from Whistler, as playing the role of the ladies' man. And one of his wives in particular, once they got back here, and they realized that this fellow was really just a logger, albeit an excellent one, surrounded by a bunch of rather dubious Finnish people that guys that he would get out of Skid Row to come up here and cut trees down with him, and living in a sort of a, what's the word, hugga-mugga, kind of a house that he built here, that was added on to and added on to and added on to, and he wasn't the prince in shining armor with a castle, but he was when he was away from Whistler. So that was another side of Seppo altogether. But he certainly had an interesting life in that regard, and I think that, in fact, I know that he got taken to the cleaners by at least one of his ladies, because of whatever didn't work out the way it was supposed to, and when all was said and done, Seppo didn't want to offend anybody, so he gave her whatever, which was most of it. And then he started all over again, and of course it happened again, and he gave the second one whatever, which was most of the second time he got, So she was generous to a fault, and even with his ladies, he fell on hard times because of that.
When you're asked to give memories of someone, you have an immediate picture in your mind. And it was before we were married, so I could say this. But coming up here skiing, you'd see Seppo, and he'd be up on the hill, he'd be wherever, and he'd be grubby. And after dinner, you go down into the Christiana, or one of the bars, and there he was, just standing at the bar with a Scandinavian sweater on and his smile, and cleaned and showered up. And he was a mountain man. He was just something else. That's my memory. I also grew up in Northern Ontario. I could always speak to him because we had a lot of Finns around.
The memory I have of him was always helping somebody. Every time I saw him, he was either picking up a child or a stroller or whatever up some stairs so that the mother with the other one hanging behind could look after that one. And the children were never afraid of him. A lot of children would bend over, if some big burly gentleman bent over their stroller or whatever, they would cry. They never did with Seppo. He couldn't understand them, or they couldn't understand him. But he always smiled, and his eyes were always sparkling. So I think that the children were just never afraid. And Sonia McCarthy's son said, I didn't understand all of the things he said, but he could tell a good story. And I think, and he really liked him because he said he was always friendly, but he could tell a good story. I just didn't know what it was all about. And I thought that was kind of a nice memory to have for these children.
Well, I first met Seppo back in 1978 when I lost my leg in 77, and I first started skiing right away, and I came up here, and it was one of the first places that you could get somewhere to stay in Whistler, right? Because it was really hard in those days. People don't remember, they talk about how hard it was to get a place now. But back then, it was really hard to get a place to stay for the winter. So finally, after I lived in North Van, and I was coming up here, and I was ski racing, and I made national ski team. And every time the Olympics came around, Seppo would, we get together with Seppo, and he'd hold a fundraiser at his place for me to go to the Olympics. And we'd have these pretty outrageous parties at his place. We almost ripped the place apart. I mean, it was bad. And it was good. Seppo had a good time. But we had Halloween parties there, so everyone went crazy. Because that was just before the ski season, and it was a good way to get some money. So anyway, Seppo was always willing to help out anybody, you know. He didn't know me from Adam, but once he saw this one-legged skier, he kind of got fond of me. He'd always talk to me, and I had a good relationship through the years with him. And he was always willing to help out with, you know, fundraisers or something for a good cause. He was always there. And I have a really soft spot in my heart for him because I really miss him. And it's a shame to go into Tapley's and not to see Seppo sitting there having a beer at 5 o'clock or whatever, right, before he moved on to his next spot. But I remember him fondly, and that was a shame when he died. It hurt me a lot, and I think it hurt everyone in Whistler.
I didn't know Seppo, and I certainly never skied with him, but can any of you here describe Seppo as a skier?
Well, he had his own kind of style of everything, you know. Life, talking, bookkeeping, and skiing. Finesse was not one of his traits on skis. He was pushed very hard. He skied on, he liked to ski on touring bindings, the earlier model, with a little heel lift, I guess, as a throwback to Finland. And I think I ever saw him fall, but you'd look at him going, oh, Jesus, oh, really? And you wonder that he was going to stand up, but he was a strong survival skier, I guess you'd have to say. He was what I would classify as a survival skier. You know,
Did he ski his own Seppo's run?
No.
No, I don't think so. That was no.
That was his last run.
That was the last run he built.
That's a black chair.
So that run was named because he cut it, not because he skied it. He and Stefan Pless would probably have skied quite a bit together in the early days. But Seppo was just as happy to. He didn't use his skis much from the point of view of commuting down the mountain. He would just as soon walk back down just the way he'd gone up.
He'd ski up with he'd wax those skis.
But he'd wax the skis, or else he'd ski up, yeah. But he did. But he pushed down, you know, he'd telemark turning and a real solid cranking down his way he'd come down the mountain.
He was more of a touring skier. He'd climb and tour, and I never thought of Seppo in terms of like downhill skiing with the rest of us. No, he'd put the Klisterwax on and just climb up the hill.
Using the lifts was yo-yo skiing.
Yeah.